Welcome back to the Liberating Generations podcast. I am Reagan Claire, and this is my mother, Dr. Keesha Ewers. In this episode, we are going to explore the relationship between generational and personal trauma and the impact it has on your eating habits, food addiction, and nourishment on all levels.
So Tricia Nelson, a dear friend of mine, is an internationally acclaimed author, transformational TEDx speaker, and emotional eating expert. She's successfully helped thousands of people heal their relationship with food and has spent the past 3 decades studying the addictive personality and shares her findings in her programs, her workshops, and her retreats. She's here to talk about her upcoming event, Make Peace with Food, and explore the far-reaching ways that trauma shows up in what and why we eat. Welcome, Tricia.
Thanks for having me. This is such a pleasure.
Oh my gosh, it's so good to be with you in this setting and for you to meet my daughter, because you have some parallel stories and different timelines. And so this is kind of exciting.
Yeah, absolutely.
So your story, we talk about, the podcast name is Liberating Generations. We talk about intergenerational trauma and the patterns that trauma creates that a lot of times we're completely unaware of until we literally crash in our lives. Sometimes it's health, sometimes it's the car, sometimes it's work, relationships, right? There's so many different ways that it'll show up. And I would love to have you share your story of how you discovered an unhealthy relationship with food and perhaps other things.
Totally. Yeah, I love talking about this stuff. So food is my first obsession, food. And I was obsessed with food as far back as I can remember. It was very much my happy place. So like going out to dinner as a kid was like really exciting. I'd have heart palpitations all day just thinking about it. So, I was somebody who overate. I was never on the other side of the spectrum. Well, I shouldn't say never, but it's definitely a spectrum. But most of the time I was on the, overeating side, binge eating side. And I definitely, of course, I wasn't aware of it at the time, but I definitely used food to cope with dysfunction in my family, to cope with pain and confusion around sexual abuse, for sure. And so I grew up, just to go there, I had a relative that I was sexual with from age 5 to 10. And this was a younger person as well. So about, 5 years older than me, but still not an adult. So this person was acting out of their own dysfunction because they had, of course, experienced sexual abuse. Not of course, but that's common, right? To hurt people. So this person acted out of their own pain around their own victimization sexually, and acted out with me. So I started, I was sexual at an inappropriate age, 5 years old, learning how to masturbate, learning how to, enjoy that, and then being in relationship with this person. And so, of course, I was very confused about sex and sexuality, and I was oversexed at a young age. So I became a compulsive masturbator. So besides food being a big obsession, so was masturbation. And they went together. So I would spend my afternoons watching TV, eating, and masturbating. So that was like a common way to numb my pain. And so, and I did that, and I had so much shame around it. Oh my God, I had so much shame about my sexuality. So this only fed into, my food addiction, numbing myself with food. And so I was a hot mess. So, but I covered it up well. Not in weight wise, I was overweight. By age 21, I was actually 50 pounds overweight, like you'd mentioned. And, but I went to top schools. I was president of my school at high school. I was, captain of different sports teams. So I did a lot of overachieving, as part of my trying to prove my worth.
I think about that.
Right. So, yeah. So I was doing all the kind of typical things that we do, and so because I did feel very worthless, I felt very worthless as a person and then when I was overweight, that added to it because I was bigger than my friends. I was very ashamed of the roll in my tummy, and I had secretive habits around food that made me feel really embarrassed and ashamed. So all that was contributing to my low sense of self-worth. So it was, yeah, that's kind of how I rolled and of course, diets didn't do a thing for me, that those didn't work. I just would bust out and binge. I was a binge eater. And then I was a binge drinker. So in high school, I started to drink and I overdrank immediately. Like I was a blackout drinker at age 14. So I was in prep school and I was drinking and I had no off button. I was an addictive personality. And so when I drank, I believe now I'm definitely a sugar addict. And I know that the blackouts, you might know more about this, Keesha, but the blackouts, to me were basically a result of my I was highly allergic to sugar, and alcohol is the most refined form of sugar there is, and so I was highly allergic to alcohol as well. So it not only had blackouts, but I would overdo it, couldn't stop. So my high school years were kind of crazy, and then I was promiscuous when I drank because I had this oversexed nature. So yeah, so it was like it was just crazy. My high school years were crazy, and again, on the outside, I made it all look okay and all that, but on the inside, I was suffering so much, and so went to college doing the same thing, and then I had to do a timeout. And that's when I moved to Seattle, actually. I moved to Seattle as my timeout from school because I was breaking down. I just was like, I can't be, I, you know, I just felt like I was wasting money being at college and I needed to find myself. So I moved across the country to get away from my family because I thought if I could just get away from my family, I'll be okay, which of course you take them with you, at least in your mind. And so but I did begin my healing journey when I was in Seattle, and that's where things started to turn around for me. Not because I geographically changed, but I was on a search, right? On a search for healing. So I'll stop there and take a breath.
I'd actually like to invite our audience to do the same thing. If when I run retreats, I do this thing when there's a big story that you might tend to disassociate from your system, just kind of tap your legs and your shoulders, take a deep breath down into your belly, just get yourself grounded again. That's when we have big stories of trauma, we all are in the energy grid together, and many of us have experienced very similar stories. And so I just want to invite everybody to drop in and be present with themselves in a really loving way. Bring your compassionate nurturer to the forefront and sit with you. Tricia, thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm also going to invite that we don't use the word crazy to describe our unskillful coping mechanism.
Yeah.
I think that's a very feminine trigger where women are so afraid, right, of being seen and thought of and called crazy. And so I get what you're saying, it's sort of.
Yeah, my behavior, it's so funny. And that's why I kept saying I didn't seem like it because nobody would look at me and say that about me. But the emotions and the thoughts inside felt very unmanageable.
Yeah. 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 And like you said, it was an unskillful coping mechanism for dealing with pain.
Yeah. No, and there's no, that's the problem with addictions and sexual abuse is you don't talk about it. Like you don't talk about it with anybody. So you have to live with this terrible burning secret, which just compounds the confusion and the pain.
How are you feeling?
I mean, thank you, first of all, so much for being so vulnerable and sharing your story. Yeah, there are a lot of similarities between the two of us, for sure. You're much further along in your healing journey than I am, but my gosh, yeah, the whole sugar addiction going hand in hand with binge drinking, because as you said, alcohol is sugar. I can reflect back to when I started drinking in high school as well at 16, and immediately I was allergic to alcohol, and my skin would get a red rash. I couldn't handle my alcohol as well as my friends could. Yeah, absolutely. And that slowly grew into me binge drinking and eventually ended developing a big problem with alcohol. And as you said, coping, using it to cope with anxiety and stress and shame, ultimately shame.
Yep. Totally.
Yeah.
For sharing that.
Yeah. So gosh, we're located in Seattle. So I find it
I know. I know. That's why I was saying it. I'm like, wow, that's full circle here.
yeah. So I mean, seriously, I find it fascinating that you moved to Seattle to start your healing journey.
I
And
know. Yeah.
so you were in college, you said, when you decided to take a break?
Yep, I took time off from my sisters had each taken time off from school. So I sort of felt like, well, that was what I should do. They're older than me.
Yeah.
So I took time off. Or that's when I felt like my parents wouldn't give me a hard time about it because they did it. So I took time off. I moved to Seattle, packed up my car, moved to Seattle, worked at the Seattle Art Museum for about a year, and I went to therapy and 12-step programs. So I was just kind of that was my foray into, and then I was doing like retreats and different stuff as well, but I was really like on this search for healing. I really wanted to heal, and that served me very well. I mean, some of the places I went to heal didn't actually end up being the place where I got my healing, but probably if I hadn't done that step, I wouldn't have made it to the next step. So it was, I'm a seeker, and I find most people, especially people with eating disorders, I find us to be seekers, where we just, and a lot of my eating was because I was empty inside. Um, and I find, I work with emotional eaters. That's what I have focused my work on, for 30 years. But I find emotional eaters, which is the term I use for anybody with disordered eating. I find that anybody with disordered eating or eating disorders are like, we're craving depth. We crave depth of conversation. We crave depth of connection.
Yeah.
Right. And we're hungry for it. Like, that's really what we're hungry for. So, thankfully I started my search early, which I'm a big fan of. And I think we're lucky that we did, start so early. Cause I mean, I'm in my 50s now, and I've never been happier, so I'm just glad I had a lot of work to do. Like, I had a lot of stuff to do. So I'm glad I started early. But for anybody, no matter when they start, I mean, I have clients who are in their 70s just starting. Literally, I was talking to somebody today who was kind of beating on herself, like, oh, I'm, so late to the party. I'm like, well, you're at the party at least. A lot of 70-year-olds are like, no, we're gonna do this in another lifetime. It's not happening this lifetime. So whenever we wake up is good.
So true.
So what are you mentioned like what you're really hungry for, and I know that's a big emphasis on how you work with people. And how does that line up? Like, what are some of the things that people are hungry for that they're unaware of?
Yeah, so the depth is a big thing. And I find that, I just like I had a hard time in my family. I grew up in the Northeast, and there was a lot of emphasis on where you go to school and how you look and everything prim and proper. And that contributed to my hunger, because there wasn't, my parents are, from the 50s. They didn't go there, they did not have depth, So I was hungry for that. And connection I mentioned as well. And so, the work I do with people is always in community, with other emotional eaters, because we help each other so much. So I always, like in my book, I talked about how that's like, however you can be in community, obviously it's better be in community with emotional eaters who have a solution, aren't just commiserating about their symptoms, but actually have a roadmap for healing. it's so healing though, because we have been in secret for so long, with our habits. We think we're the only ones. I mean, I did in my TEDx talk, I talk about garbage eating, which is eating. I used to binge and get so full, I threw out the rest of the food because I wasn't a puker. I tried, but I was not successful. So I would throw out the food, after packing it in. But then after a couple hours, I'd have a little bit more room in my tummy and I'd go fish out those cookies I'd thrown out, And so I wrote, I talked about that in my TEDx talk. I start with that, but it's amazing how many comments there are of people who are like, oh my God, I've done that, whereas, I bet you we all think we're the only ones.
Yeah.
Right? Like we all think we're the only ones. And that just exacerbates the problem because we're living in this shame, like you mentioned, Reagan, like the shame about it, which just makes it worse, And so when we can be in community with each other and realize we're not the only ones, realize we're not crazy, realize that these are actually normal things if you have this problem. And if you have trauma that you gotta, as a kid, you have no other way of coping, like food, masturbation, fantasy. Like that's kind of all you got, most of the time that you have access to. So you got to do something fast or you're going to, go find the nearest bridge. So, it's so common. It is that, the food is so soothing and accessible. So, being in community is definitely a big part of, it sets the healing environment. But obviously the path to healing, in my experience, has a lot to do with learning how to reparent ourselves, find a way to, I know we're so aligned, Keesha, and everything. It's fun talking.
Yeah.
Yeah. So self-care is so huge. I mean, I don't have I don't have a hope and a prayer of staying free from my food addiction unless I, am free of exorbitant stress. So, and so I have to really on a daily basis put my self-care first so I don't get stressed out, so I don't stress eat, because I'm not cured. And so I'm big on self-care. Probably the self-care habit that's worked best for me is meditation. I do like a transcendental meditation. So it's twice a day for 20 minutes, and I teach that, not TM specifically, but that kind of thing, because for so many reasons, right? I mean, it calms the nervous system, but also, we have to learn to just be. And that's so unusual.
And to be with uncomfortable emotions, feelings, thoughts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Without reacting.
And not running away and numbing and suppressing and
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So the meditation is good practice of that. Like, how do I just be with all these feelings and not freak out and realize I can live through them? So I think the practice of meditation is really good because in order to not overeat, you got to be with all those uncomfortable feelings without reacting with food. So meditation, prayer, reading spiritual literature, just creating a morning routine that's calming, and centering, grounding, like that. I call it putting money in your spiritual bank account. Like you got to make deposits on a daily basis that you can take withdrawals from later in the day when the stress does pile up, because life is stressful regardless, and so if you haven't made those deposits early on, you're going to be in the red, and then you're going to reach for chocolate and coffee, right? Or pot or gummies, whatever, to get by. So it's one way or another, I mean, we've got to get by somehow, and it's either with an unhealthy habit or a healthy habit. So that, to me, that morning routine is absolutely vital. And it's a non-negotiable that's a drum I beat a lot, on so many levels, but it's also on the level of just acclimating to emotions as well,
We had a discussion when, Reagan crashed her car last fall, and it was like, you're going to inpatient rehab or you can come home and I'll do the rehab with you. But
Yeah.
there's this routine that is going to get followed. Do you agree to it? She's like, yes, I'm all over it. And, like really craving it, craving a routine.
Yep.
And it was, it's like exercise every morning, a spiritual practice, an abundance practice, meditation, like all of these things. We spend hours in the morning. We get up very early, and
I love that.
It's been life-changing.
Yeah.
And I want to touch back on something you said earlier about people who have an emotional eating habit tend to be craving connection. And I was some depth, right? And I was actually down at grad school in California when my binge eating and my alcoholism started to really, really get out of hand. And I was absolutely just craving connection. I was so lonely.
Yeah.
And when I really reflect back on those habits, my mind was racing all the time. And so the only thing that would silence my mind, because I wasn't okay with being in discomfort at the time at all, I didn't have a consistent practice in place. And the only thing that would silence those voices in my head, that racing mind, was food and alcohol. And
Sure.
and obviously those were very unhealthy habits.
Yeah, but it makes sense. And I do feel like people who have food addiction have, and I know this is true for addicts in general, but the racing mind is a trait that we have in common. I feel like that's a big part of being an emotional eater is we overthink everything, and it drives us nuts. And so the food kind of gives us a little escape from that, right? From our minds that are just, and most of the things our minds are doing are beating us up, right? Like telling us why we're doing everything wrong, and who can live with that? Nobody. So we douse it with food and alcohol.
Well, one of the great things about meditation, if it's done in a way that isn't just, oh, you have to stop all your thoughts, because that's not even that's a myth around meditation. I'd like to clear that up right now.
Yeah.
Is really to be able to witness those thoughts and begin to question them. I find that people think that whatever stream of thought or consciousness that they have, they act like they're on the couch watching a movie and they have no remote control.
Right.
And whatever thoughts come up are just gems because they are the ones that created them. So they must be right and they must be on point, and it's just like, no, the more that you dive into this and the practice of self-inquiry and developing self-awareness, the more wrong that gets, where you go, oh my gosh, like just because I'm thinking it doesn't make it true, right, comforting, or any of it, right? This is what's creating my suffering. It's all right here, nothing out here.
Yeah.
And so the more that you dive into those practices, the freer and the more liberated you become from your own, right? Your own source of suffering, which is unmet expectations and, all the things that create the circling and the cycling that goes on in there, right?
Yeah, and being able to get distance from it where you can stop and look at it and say, is that right? Like, really? It's like, is that really true? I don't think so. Thanks for sharing. I'm going to go
exactly. I know. Let me give you a coloring book and some crayons and you over here and play.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So I am curious about what your mom's relationship with food was.
So she grew up overweight. So I definitely have the genetic predisposition to gaining weight because both my parents were overweight as kids, not grossly overweight, but they they were chubby as kids. Haven't heard that word in a long time.
I haven't either.
So, do you know there was I don't know if you remember, well, you probably would know this, but when I was growing up, there was a clothing line for kids for fat girls called Chubettes. And my mother,
know that one. I'm 50. Yeah. How old are you?
I'm 55. So
I don't remember that.
Right. So, well, I mean, hopefully it died quickly, but my mother came across this. She's like, oh, let's check this out. And I'm like, no, mom, I am not over my dead body. Am I wearing a brand of clothing called Chobets? No, you. So, that was just horrible branding. So, but so she grew up overweight. My dad grew up overweight. So I definitely, I gain weight really easily. So, her she definitely had issues with food. It's funny because seems like she kind of grew out of them. So they weren't terrible issues with food, but there were issues with food. I don't think there's hardly a woman on the planet, or at least in our nation, who doesn't have issues with food. But it's a relationship, right? It's a relationship. You have to work with it. It's like a relationship with money. You have to work with it every day. You can use it for good. You can use it for self abuse, and it's we got to work on it, right? So anyway, but she, growing up, definitely, she tried to control my food, and my intake of food, because she probably saw that I was gaining weight. So, and I hated her for it. Like, I hated the times that she would, push in my tummy or try to like monitor my tummy, because I had a big tummy, and I had so much resentment around that. And I'm over it now, because now I can see, oh, she probably was, she was trying to help me, and I was out of control. So what do you do? It's hard. I'm not a mother. But my sister's a mother of a kid who eats a lot, might be, a food addict in the making. And it's just it's such a hard line to walk, right? You don't want to give your kid issues, and you don't want them to just be unhealthy and self-hating either. So it's a hard thing. So anyway, now I see her efforts differently, but at the time there was tension there. Like, I want my food. Like, I'm an addict. I need my food. I need my fix. And she's trying to keep me from it. So there was tension there for sure. So it's funny because my parents produced 3 for 3. Like, we're 3 girls, and we all have food issues, and we're all on our own paths of healing. Thank goodness. But clearly, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree.
I'm curious about your experience of that.
Yeah, my experience. Yeah.
Let's open that up.
Yeah, let's open up that door.
I mean, I was a
Yeah.
complete sugar addict when the kids were growing up. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Mhm. So, growing up in the integrative medicine, functional medicine world, having my mom, who she is, I grew up watching my mom watch people. She is extremely observant. When someone has inflammation, she'll comment on it, right? Not to the person, but to me. Like, oh, this person is probably eating something that they are allergic to. If a person has a red face, then, oh yeah, they're probably consuming something that they shouldn't be. And so I took that on for sure, growing up and hearing my mom saying all these things not out of animosity or judgment by any means, just more so they were just little comments.
Pointing out data points that you can track,
that
right?
you can track. Yeah, exactly. And so
For my not emotional, but
for me, very emotional.
yeah.
And so I also grew up in doing musical theater. And of course, in the theater world, there are eating disorders galore. That's kind of, it goes with the territory. And my mom told me when I was a teenager, if she ever got caught wind of me having a problem, then she was going to pull me out of theater. So quickly, it became a very secret thing. My eating disorder became something that I kept to myself.
I didn't think about that repercussion.
Right. Because if she found out that I was bulimic, then I couldn't do the thing that I loved as a high
Right.
schooler, the one thing that I felt happy doing at that really hard age. So I kept it a secret. And I mean, I'm 25 now, and I developed that when I was 15. So for 10 years, I shared it with some people who I knew also had eating issues themselves. So friends. And I shared it with some therapists as well, just hoping that I could heal on my own. And I just recently 5.5 months ago, in the time that I have been sober from my eating disorder, I shared with my mom 5.5 months ago that that's something that was a secret for a big
Yeah.
part of my life.
Yeah, that's hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
But I mean, what an inspiration
Mhm.
and good job. But
Thank
yeah,
you.
kept it hidden really well.
Yeah, and it goes back to that shame, right?
Yeah.
When I check in with my body right now, it's really easy to go back to feeling like a 16-year-old again and not wanting my mom to take it on, not wanting her to feel like a bad mom, not wanting her to be worried about me. And I just have to remind myself, like, we're not that age anymore. We're not doing the things that we used to do to cope. And it really is. It's sitting with that discomfort and sitting with the racing mind and knowing that those emotions, if you sit with them, typically last all of 15 seconds and then they go away. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, and then I just want to say to viewership that, to the moms out there, I get asked a lot, like, how do you train your children? How do you parent a
Yeah.
child? How do you do this? And as if there's a formula that
Mhm.
works for every child. And the answer to that is absolutely there is not.
Yeah.
And, I mean, each one has their own path.
Mhm.
And I did not see that and laid the seed down with, like, I'm going to pull you from theater if I see you starting to get body obsessive
Mhm.
because it's an unhealthy, so just
Yeah.
like,
Yeah. You
no, of
mean
course
well.
it goes to ground. Like, that's just like prohibition, right? To know all the stills are in the basement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And didn't even think about that. Like, oh, maybe I could teach language that says, if you find you're struggling with this, come to
Right.
me and let's have some kind of conversation that, like not this. If you do this, that's it. Right. So yeah.
It's just so hard. I mean, coulda, woulda, shoulda, right?
Yeah. And
There's-
that's what I want to say to parents. Like, you have to go back to the unskillful version of yourself who didn't know any better. You are going to screw up. Like, that's just the way it works. There's no handbook for every kid that says, here's how you make sure they never suffer, because that's part of the human
No.
condition. And
Yeah. We're all here looking for our lessons and
learning how to forgive yourself when you weren't skillful in any given moment and asking for forgiveness from the one that got hurt, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we've had a lot of that processing, which has been really lovely.
Yes.
sweet. So
Yeah.
beautiful.
Yeah. So how do you feel?
I feel good.
Okay.
How do you feel? You're picking.
So how is the process then? Like, if you start working with a client with emotional eating, so our listeners are identifying all the bells are going off,
Uh-huh.
then what?
So what's nice is I have a step-by-step process and everybody the process is I have modules that cover my step-by-step process and they go deep on helping people understand emotional eating for one thing, because a lot of people think they understand it. Like a lot of people will say to me, "Oh, I know why I eat." Usually going back to some trauma,
Right.
right? But it's not really the trauma that causes the eating. It's like, eating becomes the coping mechanism for the trauma, right? But it's not just the eating that's a coping mechanism. There's a lot of other things we do to cope. So, like if you have a raging alcoholic parent, you become a really good people pleaser. You learn to silence your voice. You learn to be small, play small, whatever. So there's a lot of there's a big web of coping mechanisms when we have trauma that work. They do keep us off the bridge. They work. I mean, if you have a raging parent, you better be a people pleaser, right? You're gonna get your ass kicked. So
Gonna
these
be highly sensitive, intuitive also,
Yeah.
because you learn to read the room and other people.
100% hyper vigilant. So these things keep you alive and they keep you surviving that family situation or trauma, outside the family, but then they stick to you. So what worked at the time then it morphs into this coping skill you bring into adulthood. And it's those skills, and ways of being that end up driving our eating, And so I talked about the racing mind, the people pleasing. To me, emotional eaters are like, we take the cake. Sorry for the being punny, but we take the cake on people pleasing.
So what are you
Absolutely.
talking about?
Huh? So yeah, so it's like it is endemic because we don't have a strong sense of ourselves. We get it from people approving of us and telling us positive things that we don't tell ourselves. It feels good. But then people pleasing is kind of like eating. You got to keep doing it to get the hit. So it's those things that I really focus on with people. I call it the anatomy of the emotional eater. It's 24 personality traits that we are practicing on a daily basis that are like causing us to be stressed out, and it's driving us to eat. And I'll give you an example regarding the people pleasing one is like, what does that have to do with eating? Well, it's like if you are knocking yourself out trying to get everybody, like trying to please everybody for one thing, because you're saying yes to everything, trying to be all things to all people, you're not only going to be overstressed and overcommitted, and overworked, but you're also going to be resentful, and that combination of being pissed off and like exhausted is the, perfect storm for having the I deserve it binge. Like nobody else is like giving me what, because, I forgot to mention, nobody's ever as pleased as we plan on them being. So like, that's why we're pissed off because like it didn't really pay off, right? They just expect you to do more because you're so good at doing.
That's right. You train them to be that way too.
Right.
And actually that resentment that your cells bathe in, that causes autoimmune disease and cancer.
100%. Yes. Like you get sick from that. Yeah. So it's, that's why for me, to heal, like people always think, we have to deal with the underlying causes by going to therapy. And it's not that therapy isn't a good idea for many people, but you don't have to, like, you can start where you are right now in the present. Because in the present, we're doing things that are contributing to our eating right here and now. It's it's connected to the trauma, but it's our everyday way of living.
They're maladaptive memory processing.
Yes, you have great names for these things. I just, describe them, but
they're maladaptive, right? And
100%
adaptive ones that
100%. They don't work. They work in the moment, but they make us sick. They backfire on us. And so that's what I call the anatomy of the emotional eater. And so we work on these traits, finding our voice, putting boundaries on our time, letting other people do their job, not doing other people's job, not caretaking. Caretaking is a big, maladaptive trait as well. So these are the things that we work on. So I always tell people, you really don't need a lot of guidance on what to eat. You've been studying that forever. Salads are probably better than pizza. So it's like people want, like, give me the diet, but it's like, that's not the problem. You have a problem following through on the diet.
Yeah.
Right? Like you don't know how to follow through on it because you got too much stress and you got too much resentment and you got chaos. Like, let's work on that. And then you can follow through on what was healthy eating. So that's really kind of where I live with Heal Your Hunger.
That's beautiful. And the thing that you mentioned earlier in this episode is I don't think you used the word tethered, but I wasn't tethered or connected to myself. So then I'm looking for depth and connection out here.
Right.
And so what you're describing and what the introspective self-inquiry meditative practices that are so essential to do every single day, at least once a day, is exactly to do that, to tether yourself to you.
Yes.
The divine that is you.
Yes.
Right? To anchor that inside. You are not ever alone. You're never lonely if you have that connection. And so that's the thing where Reagan in graduate school used to invite all of her cohort over
on.
and feed them, and I'm just like, stop. You're
student loan money.
loan money, like quit feeding everybody. And,
Yeah.
it's that. It was that craving,
Yeah.
right? For connection and not being anchored and tethered to self in
Yeah.
such a way that, so yeah, you're not, that's the way the Enneatype type 2 operates, honey.
Totally.
And so
Oh yeah, I was just hanging out in my shadow. Sure. Yep. Me,
Funny.
accept me.
yeah, here, I'll feed you.
I'll feed you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, like, definitely that's how you were raised by an Enneagram 2 person, right?
Yeah.
And so it's just like great birthday parties. When I came home from after being sexually abused at school, my mom would have like fantastic homemade dessert waiting, cooling on the countertop, and it was like that smell of the hit, right? And then,
Yeah.
like, ooh, safety.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
birthday parties. That was a big thing. I
Yeah.
used to do these great themed parties when they were growing up, and for like holidays were a huge thing. And it was connecting.
Yeah.
And you were just trying to replicate it out
Absolutely.
in, graduate school.
Yep.
So yeah, it's so fascinating, like learning how to just be still, anchoring to the divine within.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
And
powerful.
that's why the obsession with diets and weight loss is so silly, because
So silly.
it's like it has like we're just missing it. What we need is that depth. What we need is that connection with source. What we need is to learn how to be so critical.
Give me my protocol, my list of supplements in my diet, and I will follow it to a T. I'll do everything you tell me to do. And then, of course, when it slides off,
Yeah.
it's that, oh, I always self-sabotage, and it's not self-sabotaging. It's not any of those things.
Well, it's just that it gets hard to do it if you don't have the grounding.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it really does all stem from grounding.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
does.
Yeah.
Well, Tricia, I know that you have a beautiful program. I love the name of it. That the project Make Peace with Food.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a 3-day retreat that I'm doing coming up here, and it'll be yummy, I promise. So but it really will. It's for people who do struggle with food and weight chronically and are tired of the dieting roller coaster ride and really want to take that deeper journey, and do it in community with other people who also have struggled with food and weight, and just have a new conversation, just a totally different tack. So we'll have a chef there actually doing a cooking session, a healthy cooking session. We have a movement session. So it's Make Peace with Food, love your body, love your food, love your life. So in between, the content that I'm going to be sharing about my step-by-step process for healing and taking that deeper journey, we'll have fun things like the cooking segment and the movement segment. I have some women from, I don't know if you are familiar with Clarity Breathwork, but they're going to be doing a breathwork session.
Nice.
And again, it'll be amazing community. It'll be online and in person, so people can attend either way, and they can learn about that from the same place. So
We'll put the link to that
excited.
in the show notes here, everybody.
Yeah, that'd be wonderful. So thank you for, letting me share about that, because it's a pretty unbelievable experience, and I love it. Like, I get so fed by it, and other people get so fed. So like I said, it'll be yummy.
Well, thank you for the
beautiful.
work that you do in the world and for helping people liberate
So
from
needed.
their generational trauma with food. So
Thank
So
you so
needed.
much, and back at you. I'm a big fan, Dr. Keesha, what you do, and we definitely, there's so much alignment. So thank you very much. And Reagan, great to meet you.
So great to meet you. Thank
this
you
is
so
our
much.
chef for our retreats, by the way.
Yes.
Oh, nice.
Yes.
So all that student loan money paid off. That's really
right.
So next time you run a retreat, you might want to just like think about hiring those.
Great to know. Great to know.
Good for you. All right, everybody. Until next time, be well.